For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 5074, the DHS Cyber Incident Response Team Act of 2018, as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 5074, a bill to authorize the cyber incident response teams at the Department of Homeland Security and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. McCall, and the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Thompson, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and include any extraneous material on the bill under consideration.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in strong support of the DHS Cyber Incident Response Teams Act. Before I discuss the bill, however, I'd like to say a few words about the recent bombings in my hometown of Austin. In the past month, there have been a total of 4 bombings that have killed 2 people and injured 4 others. These are heinous, hateful acts on innocent Americans, and they will not be tolerated. I know that the people of Austin very well. They will not be intimidated. I urge everyone back home to take caution and heed the warnings of local law enforcement. We will find whoever is responsible for these bombings and bring them to justice. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to now address the bill I've introduced and the threats confronting our cybersecurity. As technology advances, more and more people are relying on their computers, iPads, smartphones for both personal and professional use. In short, Mr. Speaker, everyone is a target. But our enemies do not just attack individuals and their devices. They also put America's critical infrastructure sectors in their crosshairs, endangering all aspects of civilian life. These sectors include our financial services, healthcare systems, dams, and our energy production, among others. All of them play a vital role in making America work, and each one is vulnerable to an attack. Last week, the FBI and DHS reported that Russian hackers had engineered a series of cyber attacks against American and European nuclear power plants and electric systems. Crippling or shutting down our power plants would have catastrophic effects. We also know that Russia tried to undermine the credibility of our democratic system in the 2016 elections and are likely to try again in 2018. Strengthening our cyber election security needs to be a bipartisan priority. And Russia is not the only perpetrator of these kinds of attacks. Between 2011 and 2013, Iranian hackers attacked dozens of U.S. banks and even tried to shut down a dam in New York. In 2015, we learned that Chinese hackers gained access to the private information of 80 million members and employees of Anthem Healthcare. The Chinese also stole 22 million security clearances, including my own, from OPM. This attack allowed them to obtain highly sensitive personnel data, including fingerprints and social. These greater cyber war being carried out against the United States, even as I stand here and speak. Unfortunately, it doesn't stop there. Our adversaries have weaponized technology and are using it to engage in espionage and to steal our intellectual property. This costs our economy hundreds of billions of dollars each year. In fact, former NSA Director Keith Alexander, the general, described this theft as the greatest transfer of wealth in human history. We must do more to stop these attacks. That's why I have prioritized the cybersecurity mission of DHS as chairman of the Homeland Security Committee. Through CISA, the bill before us today, which passed the House in, the previous bill, CISA, which passed the House in December, we are elevating and making operational the Department's cybersecurity and infrastructure protection missions. As part of the landmark DHS reauthorization, which passed the House in July, the Department will be required to provide voluntary assistance to state and local election officials upon request. These were important bipartisan steps, but we need to do more. The legislation before us today codifies and enhances the cyber incident response teams at DHS. These teams shall provide, upon request, assistance to asset owners and operators following cyber incidents, including with election infrastructure. These teams may also include cybersecurity specialists from the private sector to provide outside expertise, which is a new innovative breakthrough. And by fostering this new collaboration between government and private sector, we can harness our talent and maximize our efforts to stay one step ahead of our enemies. This innovative approach serves as a force multiplier to enhance our cybersecurity workforce. Being able to utilize a great number of experts will strengthen our efforts to protect our cyber networks. My bill provides that DHS provides them with that necessary capability. The American people deserve to know that we are making every effort to strengthen our cybersecurity. This bill helps us achieve that goal. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to support it, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from Mississippi.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H.R. 5074, the DHS Cyber Incident Response Teams Act of 2018, and yield myself as such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, at the outset, let me again support the chairman's comments about Austin, Texas. We talked a little bit about it last week in the hearing, and since that hearing, another incident has occurred. And terrorism, whether it's domestic or whatever, has no place in this country. And I look forward to the capture of the persons who committing these heinous acts in Austin, as well as providing whatever resources that might go toward any future apprehensions. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, last week, the Department of Homeland Security issued a technical alert with the FBI on the Russian government's efforts to use cyber tools to target our critical infrastructure, including our energy, water, aviation, and commercial facilities, critical infrastructure sectors. DHS and the FBI released the alert amidst ongoing discussions about the urgent need to better secure our election infrastructure against Russian targeting, and as the sophisticated cyber capabilities of Iran, North Korea, China, and non-state actors continue to evolve. H.R. 5074, the DHS Cyber Incident Response Teams Act of 2018, would codify DHS's hunt and incident response teams into law. The department deploys hunt and incident response teams to owners and operators of critical infrastructure upon request and free of charge after a cybersecurity incident. These DHS teams provide intrusion analysis, identify malicious actors, analyze malicious tools, and provide mitigation assistance strategies. They are DHS's boots on the ground in cyber incident response, and as such, play an integral role in improving the cybersecurity posture of critical infrastructures, owners, and operators. I urge my colleagues to support this measure. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, I have no more speakers and am prepared to close once the gentleman does.
Gentleman from Mississippi.
Mr. Speaker, I'm prepared to close. Mr. Speaker, the President's decision last week to finally issue sanctions in response to meddling in the 2016 elections was long overdue. Though it was a positive move, I believe it will do little to deter the Russian government from using cyber tools to target our critical infrastructure. The Trump administration has yet to put any meaningful strategy in place to address ongoing efforts by the Russian government or any other bad actor, for that matter, to undermine the stability of the U.S. economy and government infrastructure in cyberspace. We must ensure that organizations have access to high-quality cyber incident response capabilities. H.R. 5074 would do just that. I urge my colleagues to support it. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, this is a hugely important issue. I think cyber often gets overlooked when we look at kinetic threats of nuclear missiles coming out of North Korea, which is obviously a huge threat to the United States and its allies. But in the cyberspace, we're at a war as well with countries like Russia and China and Iran and North Korea. The Russian meddling in the elections. We can't sit idly by and let that happen again in 2018. And I think this is, as Mr. Thompson stated, a very bipartisan issue that we need to work together on against our foreign adversaries that every day are trying to undermine us, stealing intellectual property, espionage, or bringing down things in a cyber warfare attack. It's not the future of warfare. It is warfare here and now. With that, Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 5074 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, nay. Opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative. The rules are suspended. The bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
Just a quick reminder, Mox News survives solely on your tips and contributions. It's easy to make a contribution or a tip or leave a tip at moxnews.com, or there are clickable links in the text body of this video. It should take the average person, most people, probably less than 2 minutes. Thanks very much for your time and your continued support. Stay cool, Wednesdays. This war is going to end. Till that day.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Kansas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 4176, the Air Cargo Security Improvement Act of 2018, as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 4176, a bill to strengthen air cargo security and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. ESTES, and the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Thompson, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Kansas.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and include any extraneous material on the bill under consideration.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of H.R. 4176, the Air Cargo Security Improvement Act of 2017. The Transportation Security Administration is responsible for securing all modes of transportation, and implicit in this responsibility is the security of air cargo. Air cargo represents more than 35% of global trade by value, which translates to approximately $6.8 trillion worth of goods annually. Given the impact that air cargo has on the U.S. and global economy, it's not surprising that this sector remains an appealing target for terrorists. Several incidents have demonstrated that terrorists may seek to target U.S.-bound shipments by exploiting weaknesses in air cargo security overseas. In 2010, explosive devices concealed in packages bound for the United States from Yemen went undetected by initial screenings. Authorities indicated that the explosives were probably intended to detonate mid-flight over a U.S. city. More recently, in July 2017, bomb-making materials were transported undetected from Turkey to Australia in an air cargo shipment. H.R. 4176, the Air Cargo Security Improvement Act of 2017, is a timely and necessary step towards a more secure and resilient industry. This legislation establishes an Air Cargo Security Division within TSA to carry out all air cargo security policy and stakeholder engagement. Unlike TSA's operational role in passenger screening at checkpoints, TSA functions in an oversight and regulatory capacity with respect to air cargo screening. Initiatives like the Certified Cargo Screening Program and the Known Shipper Management System enable TSA to leverage key partnerships with manufacturers, shippers, freight forwarders, passenger airlines, and all cargo airlines to meet the 100% screening mandate of all freight on passenger aircraft. H.R. 4176 requires a review of the Certified Cargo Screening Program and the Known Shipper Program to ensure that applicable regulations enhance program effectiveness. These initiatives are aided by cargo screening technologies designed to meet the logistical demands of the industry. H.R. 4176 requires the TSA administrator to conduct a feasibility study and a subsequent pilot program on expanding the use of computed tomography, CT, and other emerging technologies for air cargo screening. Through October 2017, air cargo activity increased more than 10% from 2016 levels, the largest year-over-year in growth in more than a decade, with the largest growth seen among international shipments to and from the United States. In coordination with the cargo industry, Customs and Border Protection, CBP, and TSA have been pilot testing a risk-based approach to vet air cargo shipments, known as the Air Cargo Advanced Screening System, with an emphasis on improving inspections on overseas shipments. Accordingly, H.R. 4176 requires the full deployment of ACAS for inbound international air cargo. The Air Cargo Security Improvement Act of 2017 is a sensible and progressive solution that will help in modernizing the security of air cargo shipments and operations while ensuring the flow of commerce. I thank the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Thompson, for advancing this legislation. With that, I urge my colleagues to support this legislation, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time is reserved. Gentleman from Mississippi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of H.R. 4176, the Air Cargo Security Improvement Act of 2018, and yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, H.R. 4176 seeks to improve the Transportation Security Administration's ability to address air cargo-based security threats. Last July, then Secretary of Homeland Security John Kelly identified such acts as a major concern, explaining that there are people out there, very smart people, very sophisticated people, who do nothing but try to figure out how to blow up an airplane in flight. Later that month, Australian authorities charged 4 men with plotting to bring down a passenger plane on behalf of ISIS with a bomb in the air cargo hold. This foiled terror plot underscores the need for TSA to give focused attention to this clear and present security threat. The increased risk to air cargo comes at a time when the volume of goods being moved by air cargo has multiplied, with 2016 volumes nearly back to pre-recession levels. If enacted, my bill would require TSA to establish an air cargo security division to carry out air cargo security policy and stakeholder engagement responsibilities. Further, it would direct TSA to pilot emerging technologies for screening cargo, such as computed tomography for integration into current security programs. I urge my colleagues to join me in advancing this necessary and straightforward Homeland Security legislation. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Mr. Speaker, I have no more speakers and am prepared to close once the gentleman does.
Gentleman reserve his time. Gentleman from Mississippi.
Mr. Speaker, I have no further speakers, and I am prepared to close. Mr. Speaker, while passenger and baggage screening efforts are the most visible part of aviation security, protecting against air cargo-based threats is just as critical. Enactment of H.R. 4176 will ensure that TSA is positioned to stay ahead of this ever-evolving security threat that faces all who navigate our skies. With that, I strongly encourage my colleagues to support H.R. 4176, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from Kansas.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I once again urge my colleagues to support this common sense piece of legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 4176 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from Kansas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 5099, the Enhancing DHS Fusion Center Technical Assistance Program Act.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar Number 459, H.R. 5099, a bill to amend the Homeland Security Act of 2002 to establish in the Department of Homeland Security a Fusion Center Technical Assistance Program.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. ESTES, and the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Thompson, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Kansas.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and include any extraneous material on the bill under consideration.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to support H.R. 5099, the Enhancing DHS Fusion Center Technical Assistance Program Act. Today, the nation is facing a complex and evolving threat. Terrorist attacks, like the New York City vehicle attack and the Pulse nightclub shooting, have been carried out by individuals inspired by ISIS and other terrorist organizations. These type of lone wolf attacks appear to be the new normal. This means that now, more than ever, it's imperative that we have strong preventive activities in place, including intelligence and information sharing. Since 9/11, states and major urban areas established fusion centers to build up their preventive activities by creating an avenue for greater collaboration between federal, state, and local governments with regards to terrorism information sharing. These state and locally owned fusion centers have largely evolved from terrorist-focused centers to all crimes, all hazard centers, working on a range of relevant homeland security issues, including cybersecurity. I was able to see the work of one of these fusion centers firsthand when I visited my home state's fusion center, the Kansas Intelligence Fusion Center, KIFC, earlier this year. I was very impressed with their operation. I want to ensure the Department of Homeland Security is fully supporting this center and the other 78 fusion centers across the United States. That is why I was troubled to hear about a key fusion center resource in DHS not living up to its potential. In 2009, DHS created a Fusion Center Technical Assistance Program to provide fusion centers with assistance on a range of topics, including suspicious activity reporting and other relevant trainings. However, based on the findings from the committee's recent Fusion Center report and my meetings with Fusion Center personnel, this program is not meeting the needs of the national network of fusion centers. This is why I introduced H.R. 5099, the Enhancing DHS Fusion Center Technical Assistance Program Act. This bill provides a formal authorization for DHS Fusion Center Technical Assistance Program and a clear set of directives on the services to be provided by the program, including assistance related to available grant funding and DHS terrorism prevention programs, as well as intelligence and information sharing. The bill expands the role of the program to include being a repository of best practices relevant to Fusion Center activities, including cybersecurity. This is a common sense bill that should help strengthen the nation's ability to prevent and protect against terrorist attacks and other Homeland Security relevant events. Earlier this month, this legislation was passed out of the Committee on Homeland Security by voice vote. I would like to thank Chairman McCall and Mr. Gallagher for co-sponsoring this legislation, and I urge all my colleagues to support this bill. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H.R. 5099, the Enhancing DHS's Fusion Center Technical Assistance Program Act, and yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, H.R. 5099 would authorize the Department of Homeland Security's existing Fusion Center Technical Assistance Program. Currently, there are 79 fusion centers operating in the United States. Each fusion center relies on DHS to help assist with intelligence products and information sharing activities, terrorism prevention initiatives, and homeland security grant programs. This bill seeks to solidify engagement between representatives at the fusion centers with their partners in the departments like FEMA and the DHS Intelligence Branch. Specifically, the program provides technical assistance on topics like best practices for information sharing regarding threats and operating a fusion center. By codifying this existing program, H.R. 5099 seeks to strengthen DHS's partnership with fusion centers to ensure that they are well positioned to address a wide range of diverse security threats that may emerge. The bill passed committee unanimously and would amend the Homeland Security Act of 2002. I urge my colleagues to support this measure. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Kansas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I have no more speakers and am prepared to close once the gentleman does.
Gentleman reserves.
Mr. Speaker, I am prepared to close. Mr. Speaker, the security and well-being of our country is dependent upon the timely sharing of threat information between our law enforcement and intelligence personnel. Importantly, one of the key areas where DHS will provide expertise to fusion centers under H.R. 5099 is with respect to the protection of privacy, civil rights, and civil liberties. I strongly encourage my colleagues to support H.R. 5099. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Kansas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I consume.
The gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the ranking member for his support on this legislation, and I'd once again urge my colleagues to support this common sense bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill, H.R. 5099? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the ayes have it. The rules are suspended. The bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from Kansas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 4227, the Vehicular Terrorism Prevention Act of 2017, as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 4227, a bill to require the Secretary of Homeland Security to examine what actions the Department of Homeland Security is undertaking to combat the threat of vehicular terrorism and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. ESTES, and the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Thompson, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Kansas.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and include any extraneous material in the bill on the bill under consideration.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of H.R. 4227, the Vehicular Terrorism Prevention Act, introduced by the gentleman from Ohio, Representative Robert LATTA. H.R. 4227 requires the Secretary of Homeland Security to examine the threat of vehicular terrorism and develop a strategy to improve DHS support for the efforts of emergency responders and the private sector to prevent, mitigate, and respond to such a threat. Terror groups, including ISIS and al-Qaeda, have urged supporters to carry out attacks in their home countries using any means necessary, including vehicle ramming. Terrorists and inspired homegrown extremists have heeded this directive and have carried out vehicle-based attacks in the past several years, including in France, England, Spain, Ohio, and most recently in New York City. The majority of prevention, mitigation, and response activities related to vehicle attacks are carried out by first responders and the private sector. DHS has existing resources and programs that can be better utilized to prepare frontline personnel in local communities to address this threat. This includes guidance related to the use of existing grant programs, increased information sharing, promoting suspicious activity reporting, increasing available exercises and training programs, dedicated research and development targeting mitigation measures, and utilizing critical infrastructure protection programs for vehicle ramming prevention. H.R. 4227, the Vehicular Terrorism Prevention Act, requires the Secretary to develop a plan on how to improve and increase those capabilities. This bill passed by voice vote by the Committee of Homeland Security in early March. I want to thank Representative LATTA for his work on this important measure and urge my colleagues to support the bill. Thank you, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields, or gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H.R. 4227, the Vehicular Terrorism Prevention Act of 2017, and yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, terror groups have urged their supporters to carry out acts of violence by any means necessary, including by ramming a vehicle into a crowd. In fact, both ISIS and Al-Qaeda have published propaganda encouraging such vehicle-based terrorist attacks. Sadly, over the past few years, vehicle-based terrorist attacks have been carried out at home and abroad, taking the lives and injuring too many innocent people. One of the most shocking attacks was carried out on July 14, 2016, when a truck plowed into a crowd celebrating France's Independence Day, which resulted in the death of 86 people and injuring nearly 500. More recently, in October 2017, a driver took the lives of 8 people when he purposely careened his truck into a path in Lower Manhattan that was full of pedestrians and cyclists. This tactic has not confined itself to one ideological group. On August 12, 2017, a self-professed neo-Nazi drove his car into a crowd of counter-protesters demonstrating the march held by alt-right activists in Charlottesville, Virginia. The attack killed Heather D. Heyer and injured 35 others. Just this month, a former Marine Corps reservist rammed his pickup truck into a convenience store in Watson, Louisiana. Later, we learned that he mistakenly believed this store was owned by Muslims. To address this emerging threat, H.R. 4227 would require the Department of Homeland Security to report to Congress on support provided to emergency responders and private sector partners to counter the threat of vehicle-based attacks. I support this timely legislation and believe that enactment would improve DHS's efforts to prevent and reduce the impacts of such attacks. I urge my colleagues to support this measure and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Kansas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield as much time as he may consume to the gentleman from Ohio, the sponsor of the bill, Representative LATTA.
The gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of my legislation, H.R. 4227, the Vehicular Terrorism Prevention Act. This bipartisan legislation requires the Secretary of Homeland Security to assess the activities the Department is undertaking to combat the threat of vehicular terrorism and submit a strategy to Congress on its findings and recommendations. Over the past several years, I've been alarmed with the increased frequency that terrorists in Europe and around the world have used vehicles, oftentimes rental vans or trucks, to commit heinous acts of violence. From Paris to Barcelona and Jerusalem to London, at least 138 people have been killed and countless others seriously injured because of these attacks. With the October attack in New York City showing that these extremist groups would not hesitate to carry out the same attack on American soil, it is critical that the Department of Homeland Security is doing their due diligence regarding this threat. Mr. Speaker, this legislation would specifically require DHS to assess the activities the department is undertaking to support emergency response providers and the private sector to prevent, mitigate, and respond to the threat of vehicular terrorism. Within 6 months of the bill's enactment, the department must complete this assessment and submit to Congress a strategy that includes an examination of the current threat of vehicular terrorism, methods to improve information sharing activities with emergency first responders and the private sector, and training activities the department can undertake to prevent and prepare to respond to these attacks. The Secretary must also include any additional activities that DHS recommends to address the threat of vehicular terrorism. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank Chairman McCall, Ranking Member Thompson, Representative Donovan, and the entire House Homeland Security Committee for their work in advancing this bill to the House floor. I urge my colleagues to join with me in taking the next step to addressing this dangerous threat by passing H.R. 4227, and I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
The gentleman yields. Gentleman from Kansas.
Mr. Speaker, I have no more speakers and am prepared to close once the gentleman does.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am prepared to close, and I will do so. Mr. Speaker, the emergence of lone wolves who choose to ram vehicles into innocent people to advance their violent ideologies is a modern-day homeland security challenge. As threats to our homeland continue to evolve, and as violent extremists continue to exploit soft targets, the risk to innocent bystanders grows. We must do our part to ensure that first responders in our cities, towns, and all places of living throughout the country have access to the necessary resources to keep themselves safe and secure. This legislation seeks to ensure that DHS does all it can to support such efforts. I'd also note that this bill complements H.R. 5131, which is also being considered today and which directs DHS to disseminate best practices to stakeholders regarding ways to enhance transportation security against the threats of vehicle-based attacks. As such, I strongly encourage my colleagues to support H.R. 4227 and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from Kansas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the Ranking Member Thompson and once again urge my fellow colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
And yields the balance of his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 4227? Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being the affirmative.
Mr. Chairman, I request the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having arisen, the yeas and nays are ordered pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20. Further proceedings on this question will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Nebraska seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 5079, the DHS Field Engagement Accountability Act, as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 5079, a bill to amend the Homeland Security Act of 2002 to require the Department of Homeland Security to develop an engagement strategy with fusion centers and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Bacon, and the gentlewoman from New Jersey, Ms. Watson-Coleman, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Nebraska.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and include any extraneous material on the bill under consideration.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of H.R. 5079, the DHS Field Engagement Accountability Act. The sharing of counterterrorism and other Homeland Security information with state and local officials is vital in our efforts to protect the homeland. Fusion centers, as hubs for information sharing and analysis, play a critical role in the domestic Homeland Security information sharing environment. Over the years, there have been vast improvements in DHS's support for these key stakeholders, including the Nebraska Information Analysis Center, known as the NIAC, in my home state of Nebraska. H.R. 5079, the DHS Field Engagement Accountability Act, builds on ongoing efforts to hold DHS more accountable for supporting fusion centers and fully utilizing them as a resource to the federal government. First, it requires DHS to develop a strategy for engagement with fusion centers. With the maturation of the national network, many fusion centers have adopted an all threats, all hazards mission to ensure they are keeping pace with the changing threat environment. A strategy that incorporates all the components of department will ensure DHS is supporting and leveraging fusion centers effectively and efficiently. Second, this bill mandates performance metrics to hold DHS personnel in the field accountable. Among other responsibilities, these personnel serve as ambassadors of the department and are integral in shaping the strengthening the relationship between fusion centers and DHS. As such, the department must have appropriate performance objectives and metrics in place to ensure greater transparency in the expectations of these officers and accountability when issues arise. Finally, this bill requires additional training and improvements for both the classified and unclassified information sharing systems that the departments make available to fusion centers and other law enforcement agencies. While DHS has made strides in facilitating fusion center access to information and information systems, there are gaps in the department's efforts to ensure these partners are adequately trained to utilize these systems. So, for example, while all fusion centers now have access to DHS classified HSDN, many fusion center personnel are not proficient in this system, and DHS does not currently provide any standardized in-person HSDN training. Granting the appropriate clearances and credentials to access DHS systems is just as important as ensuring competency when using these systems. Additionally, I have learned that many DHS components do not routinely share analytic products on the Homeland Security Information Network Intelligence Portal, and many documents are not posted on a timely basis. It is incumbent on the department to ensure the appropriate policies and metrics are in place to incentivize component use of this critical information sharing program. So in that regard, I am pleased to report that as of this month, both the Federal Protective Service and the United States Coast Guard have started participating on the HSIN or Intel Partners product page. I encourage other components of the department that do not participate to follow suit. This is a common sense bill with bipartisan support that will enhance the DHS relationship with state and local fusion centers across the country. In short, we have learned many lessons this past year in analyzing and studying fusion centers. This bill fixes the multiple problems that we've encountered. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Nebraska reserves. The gentlewoman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of H.R. 5079, the DHS Field Engagement Accountability Act, and I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. H.R. 5079 would require the Department of Homeland Security to develop a fusion center engagement strategy. One of the tragic lessons of the September 11 attacks was what can happen when information is not shared at all levels of law enforcement. Since 2006, the committee has supported the department's efforts to deploy intelligence analysts to many of the 79 fusion centers across the country. These fusion centers are charged with connecting the dots at the state or local level to prevent terrorist or extremist violence. H.R. 5079 continues in this vein by directing DHS to focus on strengthening its relationship with the fusion centers. At a time when violent attacks in Florida, New York, Las Vegas, and Charlottesville are tragically all too much a part of our new normal, we need this improved relationship between the department and fusion centers more than ever. In addition to requiring an engagement strategy, the bill requires DHS to have metrics in place to hold the personnel it deploys to fusion centers and accountable for their performance. Finally, this legislation seeks to encourage use of the department's intelligence and document sharing systems to promote greater engagement among the department and fusion centers across the country. Specifically, H.R. 5079 would create policies for information sharing via department networks that are developed and updated in consultation with the department's experts on privacy, civil rights, and civil liberties. I urge my colleagues to support this measure and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from Nebraska.
Mr. Speaker, I have no more speakers and I'm prepared to close once the gentlelady from New Jersey does.
The gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman from New Jersey.
Mr. Speaker, I don't have any more speakers, and I am prepared to close.
Gentlewoman's recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. With the emergence of lone wolves and small terrorist cells, the decentralized terrorist threat in the United States poses serious threats to local communities across our country, from big cities to small towns. Whether the target is a church in South Carolina, a Sikh temple in Wisconsin, a mosque in Illinois, a synagogue in New York, a concert venue in Las Vegas, or a school in Florida, state and local law enforcement need a clear line of communications with federal agencies. As such, DHS must ensure that fusion centers throughout the country have access to the resources, including personnel, training, and access to information necessary to keep the U.S. homeland safe and secure. H.R. 5079 directs DHS to do just that by requiring the department to have a strategy to enhance engagement with fusion centers and provide fusion center personnel. Additionally, H.R. 5079 would ensure that DHS's information sharing policies include strong privacy and civil liberty safeguards. I therefore encourage my colleagues to support H.R. 5079, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from Nebraska.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, first I want to thank the gentlelady from New Jersey for her comments and her support making this bill a bipartisan bill. Proud of the work that we're doing. We're going to improve 70 different fusion centers with this bill and standardize the performance of all of them. So I once again urge my colleagues to support this bill. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 5079? Those as amended. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Does the gentleman from Nebraska seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 5131, the Surface Transportation Security Improvement Act of 2018, as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 5131, a bill to improve the effectiveness of federal efforts to identify and address homeland security risks to surface transportation, secure against vehicle-based attacks, and conduct a feasibility assessment of introducing new security technologies and measures, and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Bacon, and the gentlewoman from New Jersey, Ms. Watson-Coleman, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Nebraska.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and include any extraneous material on the bill under consideration.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of H.R. 5131, the Surface Transportation Security Improvement Act of 2018, as amended. As you may be aware, TSA was created in response to the terrorist attacks on September 11th. While the impetus behind its creation was the threat to aviation security, TSA is responsible for securing all transportation modes, including surface transportation assets such as railroads, mass transit, pipelines, buses, and ports. Given the persistent threats facing aviation in the post-9/11 era, TSA's main focus has been securing the aviation sector. However, in recent years, threats emanating against surface transportation modes, especially mass transit hubs, have steadily increased. Against these surface targets often require less sophistication than attacks against aviation, making them especially attractive to lone wolves or homegrown violent extremists. Surface transportation systems are also a very attractive target due to their large volume of daily ridership and open infrastructure. The most recent example of an attack targeting surface is the attempted suicide bombing in December 2017 at the New York City's Port Authority bus terminal. Given the current threat environment, a review of TSA's approach to securing all transportation modes and an assessment of the degree to which surface transportation security should be prioritized is certainly warranted. Specifically, this bill mandates a GAO review of the National Strategy for Transportation Security, the development of risk-based priorities for all transportation modes, and a feasibility assessment of utilizing security technologies for surface transportation assets. Furthermore, the bill requires TSA to disseminate best practices for enhancing security against vehicle-based terrorist attacks and authorizes a surface-focused innovation task force. Finally, the bill requires a threat assessment of certain security technologies tied to foreign countries and a strategy for TSA's surface transportation inspectors. In the face of emerging threats, it is imperative that Congress ensure TSA is adequately executing its mission to protect all transportation modes, not just aviation. I thank the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Transportation and Protective Security, Ms. Watson Coleman, for authoring this legislation, as well as the chairman of the subcommittee, Mr. Katko, for his support and leadership on this issue. Thank you, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. I recognize the representative from New Jersey, Ms. Watson Coleman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong support of H.R. 5131, the Surface Transportation Security Improvement Act of 2018, and yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentlewoman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the nation's surface transportation systems are central to America's daily life. Subways, buses, trains, and pipelines move millions of people and goods every day. Given their criticality, it is no surprise that terrorists have targeted these systems for attack. In recent years, attacks overseas have proven lethal, even more so on an average than attacks against aviation. In December 2017, the threat against these systems hit home when a would-be attacker detonated a bomb within New York City's Port Authority bus terminal subway station. My bill, H.R. 5131, would require the Department of Homeland Security to take meaningful steps to address this emerging threat. First, it would require TSA to take a more comprehensive approach to transportation threats when it comes to assessing risk and setting strategies and priorities. Second, it would require TSA to take a hard look at integrating new technologies and security measures into mass transit and other surface transportation systems. Importantly, H.R. 5131 also would require DHS to assess cyber threats posed by foreign technologies and to disseminate best practices for securing transportation systems against vehicle-based attacks, such as the truck attack we witnessed in New York City last October. Finally, it would require TSA to develop a risk-based strategy for its surface inspectors and answer to Congress for its failure to issue long overdue regulations that are required by the implementing recommendations of the 9/11 Commission Act of 2007. Consideration of H.R. 5131 today is timely, given the cuts to surface transportation security programs proposed by the President in both the fiscal year 2018 and 2019 budgets. I urge my colleagues to support this measure to improve surface transportation security. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlelady reserves. The gentleman from Nebraska is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I have no more speakers. I am prepared to close once the gentlelady from New Jersey makes her closing comments.
The gentleman reserves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't have any other speakers, so I am also prepared to close.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we have seen around the world, the threats to surface transportation systems are real and evolving. A major attack on any one system could be devastating and result in significant loss of life. My bill will push TSA to increase and enhance its efforts to secure these critical systems. I strongly encourage my colleagues to support this. I appreciate the support from my colleague and the support from Mr. Katko, and with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Nebraska is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I again want to commend the gentlelady from New Jersey on her work on this bill, and Mr. Katko, the chairman of the subcommittee. This is obviously very important. Airports aren't the only target. We have bus transportation. We've seen those targeted in Europe. We know rail centers are also targets. We've seen that in Europe, and we've seen the indications of those attacks being planned here as well. So once again, I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 5131 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair,
I request the yeas and nays.
In the opinion of the chair, two-thirds being recognized. Nebraska.
Mr. Speaker, I request the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on the question will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Nebraska seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 4467, the Strengthening Aviation Security Act of 2018, as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 4467, a bill to require the Federal Air Marshal Service to utilize risk-based strategies and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Bacon, and the gentlewoman from New Jersey, Ms. Watson-Coleman, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Nebraska.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that members have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and include any extraneous material on the bill under consideration.
That objection so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman from Nebraska is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of H.R. 4467, Strengthening Aviation Act of 2017. Described by Chairman McCall in his State of National Security Address as the crown jewel of ISIS and other terrorist groups, the American aviation industry remains a key target of terrorism. The Transportation Security Administration has made great strides in securing commercial flights, but the threat of evolving terror tactics requires a comprehensive, multilateral approach informed by data collected from industry. TSA's risk management strategy for passenger aviation security is characterized by a multi-layered approach whereby TSA deploys a variety of security countermeasures to detect and deter threats. Federal Air Marshals, also known as FAMs, are armed law enforcement officers deployed on passenger flights as part of TSA's comprehensive security strategy to protect airline passengers and crew against criminals and terrorists. Due to the high volume of passenger flights and limited resources at TSA, it is imperative that FAM deployment is risk-based and strategic in order to achieve the greatest security value. However, a recent GAO report from September 2017 found that TSA does not measure data on the efficiency or efficacy and the deterrence value of FAMs. Without viable metrics, it is impossible for TSA to truly employ a calculated risk management strategy for passenger aviation security. Accordingly, the Strengthening Aviation Security Act of 2017 requires the Federal Air Marshal Service to utilize risk-based strategies when allocating resources for international and domestic flight coverage. This bill ensures that FAMs are deployed in a manner that adds strategic value to TSA's multi-layered security approach. As amended, the bill also requires TSA to take their risk-based approach a step further by ensuring that FAMs are seated in tactical positions when deployed on the aircraft. Strategic seating arrangements will provide FAMs with a distinct advantage in the event of a threat to aviation security and ensure that they are more relevant to the important mission for which they're tasked. The Strengthening Aviation Security Act emphasizes the importance of intelligence-driven, risk-based decisions to make the best use of the Federal Air Marshal Service's resources and personnel. I thank the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Heiss, for authoring this legislation, as well as the chairman from the subcommittee, Mr. Katko, for his work on this bill. Additionally, I wish to thank the chairman of the full committee, Mr. McCall, for moving the bill through the committee process. This bill will promote public confidence in the security of the nation's aviation system and ensure that armed federal law enforcement officers are deployed on passenger flights where they are most needed. Thank you, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlelady from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of H.R. 4467, the Strengthening Aviation Security Act of 2017, and I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it has been over 16 years since the September 11th terrorist attacks. Since that time, our transportation security systems have evolved in a number of ways, from the creation of the TSA to the hardening of cockpit doors. An important change to security has been the evolution of the Federal Air Marshal Service. Federal Air Marshals are armed law enforcement officers who are deployed on domestic and international passenger flights to protect passengers and crew against terrorist attacks. On 9/11, the FAA employed a small number of Federal Air Marshals to serve as in-flight security on a small percentage of flights. After 9/11, the Federal Air Marshal Service expanded rapidly, and in 2005, it was transferred to the TSA, where it operates today. Today, Air Marshals contribute to aviation security by deploying on many domestic and international flights. They also help secure surface transportation systems and public airport areas as major participants in TSA's Visible Intermodal Prevention and Response, or VIPER teams. To ensure the continued effectiveness of the Air Marshals, H.R. 4467 requires TSA to ensure that officers are deployed in a risk-based manner that is focused on maximizing effectiveness. As amended, the bill also ensures risk-based seating of air marshals on passenger aircraft to enable officers to respond effectively to security threats. This is a sensible bill to improve aviation security, and I urge my colleagues to support it. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlelady reserves. Gentleman from Nebraska is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield as much time as he may consume to the gentleman from Georgia, the sponsor of this bill, Mr. Heiss.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman from Nebraska very much. I rise in strong support of my bill, H.R. 4467, the Strengthening Aviation Security Act. Mr. Speaker, last year I learned that while the Federal Air Marshal Service considers its travel budget and the number of personnel when determining which flights will be covered by air marshals, they do not consider risk. This current system might maximize the number of flights covered by air marshals, but it does not ensure that the highest risk flights, those likely to be hijacked by a potential terrorist, would be covered by air marshals. The Strengthening Aviation Security Act would fix this flawed policy by requiring the Federal Air Marshal Service to incorporate risk in its deployment strategy in 3 ways. First, this legislation requires the Federal Air Marshal Service to utilize risk-based strategy when allocating resources between international and domestic flight coverage. Currently, the Federal Air Marshal Service does not account for risk when it sets its annual target numbers of average international and domestic flights to cover. Second, this legislation requires the Federal Air Marshal Service to utilize a risk-based strategy to support domestic allocation decisions. Currently, these decisions are made based on the professional judgment of subject matter experts. Without documented risk assessments, the Federal Air Marshal Service cannot justify to TSA, the Department of Homeland Security, or Congress why it chooses to deploy air marshals on certain flights and not on others. Third, this legislation requires the Federal Air Marshal Service to utilize a risk-based strategy to support international allocation decisions. Shockingly, the Federal Air Marshal Service does not currently document the rationales for their international allocation decisions. Without this documentation, there is no verifiable method to determine whether decisions are intelligence-driven, risk-based, or even in compliance with TSA or DHS directives. Unless the Federal Air Marshal Service accounts for risk at every level of its deployment strategy, it cannot ensure that it is devoting its resources to cover high-risk flights. It is incumbent upon us in Congress to address any vulnerabilities to our national security and enable our federal agencies to effectively deter, detect, and disrupt any attacks planned by our enemies, and this legislation does just that. I'd like to thank Chairman McCall and Chairman Katko for their strong support of this legislation, and I urge all my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back.
Mr. Speaker, I have no more speakers and are prepared to close once the gentlelady from New Jersey is done.
Gentleman reserved.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have no more speakers, and I'm prepared to close.
Gentlelady from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, the threats to aviation continue to require constant vigilance and effective security solutions. The Federal Air Marshal Service does not have unlimited budgetary resources to deploy marshals on every passenger flight. As such, resources must be allocated based on risk. H.R. 4467 will help ensure TSA does just that, and I encourage my colleagues to support it. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Nebraska is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
This bill makes total sense. If you're going to use federal air marshals, let's use them where they're needed most. It should be analytical, scientifically based, so we get the most bang for the buck. With that, I urge my colleagues to support this bill. Now yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 4467 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative.
Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from Nebraska is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I request yeas and nays.
Yeas and nays have been requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Nebraska seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 5089, the Strengthening Local Transportation Security Capabilities Act of 2018, as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 5089, a bill to improve threat information sharing, integrated operations, and law enforcement training for transportation security and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Bacon, and the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Berrigan, will each control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Nebraska.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and include any extraneous material on the bill under consideration.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of H.R. 5089, the Strengthening Local Transportation Security Capabilities Act of 2018. As evidenced by recent attacks in New York, London, and elsewhere around the world, the threat against surface transportation is real and it's unwavering. While the Department of Homeland Security, the Transportation Security Administration, and other federal entities have made significant progress in providing support to state and local surface transportation assets, the current threat environment necessitates a coordinated approach. Intelligence sharing is the backbone of informed, risk-based security, yet the top-down dissemination of this information is often stymied by bureaucracy and classification barriers. This begs the question, how effective is intelligence collection and analysis if it does not reach the front line and inform subsequent decision-making? H.R. 5089, the Strengthening Local Transportation Security Capabilities Act of 2018, requires the DHS Secretary to prioritize the assignment of officers and intelligence analysts from TSA, and as appropriate, the DHS Office of Intelligence and Analysis, or INA, to fusion centers in jurisdictions with high-risk surface transportation assets. High-risk surface transportation assets transport millions of people and commodities daily and are critical for the vitality of the American economy. This legislation will streamline and enhance the intelligence sharing process so that these high-risk systems are better prepared to be resilient against emerging threats. A common complaint from owners, operators, law enforcement, and first responders is that TSA and the federal government in general does not provide sufficient information for them to adequately prepare for threats. This is primarily due to issues surrounding classification, where key personnel at the state and local levels do not have access to pertinent security information. As such, this bill requires the Secretary to make security clearances available to appropriate stakeholders, thereby making important and relevant threat information more accessible to the people who are heavily involved in the day-to-day security operations of surface transportation systems. H.R. 5089 also requires the TSA administrator to share with owners and operators a framework for unified operation centers to ensure robust response to security incidents. Recent terror attacks and plots illustrate the challenges of effective coordination in a system of systems. This bill will streamline coordination efforts between federal, state, and local entities to bring the right information to the right people. The interconnected, diverse, and readily accessible nature of surface transportation systems creates unique security challenges that are best addressed by communication, coordination, and collaboration. H.R. 5089 will create a structural framework to connect the Department of Homeland Security, the Transportation Security Administration, and surface transportation stakeholders and facilitate timely information sharing. I thank the gentlelady from California, Ms. Berrigan, for her leadership on this issue. I also thank the chairman of the Subcommittee on Transportation and Protective Security, Mr. Katko, as well as the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mrs. Watson-Coleman, for their dedication to improving surface transportation security. Thank you, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlelady from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in strong support of my bill H.R. 5089, the Strengthening Local Transportation Security Capabilities Act of 2018, and yield myself as much time as I might consume.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in 2013, my home airport, Los Angeles International Airport, came under attack when a gunman opened fire at a TSA security checkpoint, killing TSA officer Gerardo Hernandez and injuring many others. This shooting was just one of several recent attacks on relatively soft targets, such as public airport areas and surface transportation systems. In the wake of the shooting at LAX, Congress passed the Gerardo Hernandez Airport Security Act of 2015, which made several important security improvements, including directing airports and high-risk surface transportation systems to install incident response plans and requiring TSA to provide active shooter training to all its screening personnel. Now, over 2 years later, it's time to take the next step in improving security for these soft targets. Enactment of my bill, H.R. 5089, is that next step. H.R. 5089 is focused on enhancing the capabilities of local transportation security stakeholders to prevent and respond to terrorist attacks and other serious incidents. State and local stakeholders, including transit system owners and operators and law enforcement agencies, play a significant role in securing surface transportation systems against threats. Yet many stakeholders cite a lack of sufficient information from TSA and the federal government to adequately prepare for these threats. The Strengthening Local Transportation Security's Capabilities Act of 2018 requires DHS to prioritize the assignment of officers and intelligence analysts to fusion centers in jurisdictions with a high-risk surface transportation asset, thus improving information sharing. Further, it directs TSA to make a framework available to stakeholders for establishing operation centers responsible for overseeing daily operations of transportation facilities, allowing for improved communications. Finally, it authorizes DHS to develop a training program through the federal law enforcement training centers to enhance the capabilities of law enforcement agencies operating at service transportation assets. Taken together, The provisions build upon previous efforts to secure transportation systems by enhancing the protection, preparedness, and response capabilities of state and local partners working to protect these critical systems. With that, I urge my colleagues to support this measure and reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlelady reserves. The gentleman from Nebraska is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I have no more speakers and prepared to close once the gentlelady from California and my fellow freshman is all done.
Gentleman reserves. The gentlelady from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am prepared to close.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the shooting at LAX, along with attacks on surface transportation systems and public airport areas in New Orleans, Fort Lauderdale, New York City, and overseas, have proven that acts of terror are not limited to the aviation sector. To effectively address threats to service transportation systems, state and local stakeholders must be able to communicate not only with TSA and the federal government, but amongst themselves during an incident. My bill seeks to bridge potential gaps in communication and coordination capabilities. I strongly urge my colleagues to support H.R. 5089 and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields. Gentleman from Nebraska is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as it may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If we have important information we can't share it to the right decision makers at the local level, we fail. We've learned from 9/11 and other places where information is bottled up, doesn't get to the people who need it. This bill helps solve that. So with that, I once again urge my colleagues to support this bill. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 5089 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, gentleman from Nebraska is recognized. The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed.